The first one I say, from my understanding, the essential problems with epistemology derive from the nature of language and axioms upon which various underlying linguistic structures are based and then afterwards interpreted. As you have said in your videos, the probability that you construe some of the same definitions of insert random word person says and in the same way are virtually zero. One of the best examples I can give for this is the language that is used in physics. It is widely misconstrued as the pragmatic meanings behind words and their context are worlds debased from the vague linguistic constructed views of the actual linguistic definitions that people construe. So, such is the problem with the word dimension, in which it is understood in a more semantic sense, but not in an abstract sense in which the word is implied. The first chapter of Einstein's theory of special and general relativity, Einstein stresses that geometry is an abstract model. Time per se is not a dimension. The theory of special relativity merely treats any one clock time as dimension of an abstract construct. So for the next three questions I have, I want this to be considered as a means of...
Okay, so my answer to that fundamentally, I think the best answer to that was provided by the American pragmatists. So that'd be William James and his crew. That would include a guy named Peirce, P-I-E-R-C-E, who was perhaps the best philosopher that the U.S. ever produced, C.S. Peirce, but who's somewhat underappreciated and was certainly so in his own life. Part of the way that different people hone in on the same definition is to define what an acceptable outcome would be to their joint interactions, and then to hone their language until they achieve that outcome, and then to consider that good enough. And see, Peirce and his crew basically said that you could never do anything better than that. So let's say we're trying to communicate about how we're going to move a wheelbarrow full of bricks from one side of the yard to the other. Well, basically what we've decided is we've communicated good enough if the bricks get moved. And so what you have to do is you have to set up a practical surround, in some sense, around your conversation. And that practical surround constitutes what you are willing to consider as proof that conversation or that communication has taken place sufficiently. I mean, it's complicated. It's partly why the robotics engineers, types like Rodney Brooks, discovered back in the 1980s that you really couldn't have intelligent machines without embodiment, because you need a real-world target against which to measure the effectiveness of your communication. Because, as you said, I mean, this is where the postmodernists have it right, is that there is a lot of different ways of interpreting everything. So how do you know when your interpretation is good enough? And the answer to that is you agree a priori what would constitute good enough. And when you hit that target, then you're done.
All right, thank you. And I'll look into C.S. Peirce. Okay.
Yep, C.S. Peirce, yep.
All right. And
look up the American pragmatists. They got it right, man.
All right. And then, the next one is on transgenderism. And conservatives strongly boast a biological and scientific claim of two genders or two sexes based on what language we're going to use. They believe, and I believe rightfully so, in biological differences between males and females. But I've never heard a liberal argue, and from my perspective, I think I could partially combat this, but it's an argument that hasn't been raised from the liberal side, which I think should have. Biological differences in the brain. Women can see more shades of color on average, and men can have better spatial orientation on average. Steven Pinker's book.
There's massive neurological and biological differences between men and women. They're well documented, but the postmodernist types just assume that the scientists who conducted the investigations are suffering from the same bias that they think permeates everything else, so they just discount it.
Yes. So is it really crazy to believe that someone could be born with biological similarities to an XY brain and biological XX
No, not at all. Not at all. Look,
okay.
That isn't the argument that I'm making.
All right.
The argument that I'm making is that gender identity is strongly influenced by biological sex.
Okay.
And the problem is that the legislation, especially the legislation that's being introduced in Canada, argues that it's not.
Yes.
And that's just not helpful. It's not even helpful for the transgender types, because some of them, for sure, there are people who have mixed biological sex.
All right,
there are women who have some cells in their body that have male chromosomes.
Yes.
And then not a trivial number, for example. And there are people who are born with genitalia that aren't identifiable, and there are more genuine hermaphroditic types. And there's no doubt that there are some men that have a more feminine personality structure and some women that have a more masculine personality structure, and that's biologically influenced. So I would separate. I'm not making a biological case that there are two genders, the end.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
I'm making a case that sexual identity is unbelievably powerfully influenced by biology, with certain exceptions, and that those exceptions themselves might be biologically determined. Not in all cases, but in many. And so part of the reason I was objecting to legislation like Bill C-16 is because it insists that gender identity is socially constructed. Well, if gender identity is socially constructed, then why can't we just take transgender people and socialize them back into their normative sex roles?
Exactly.
Right, exactly. So that's part of the reason I was objecting to the legislation.
Yes.
One of the most powerful arguments, and I said this, I did a presentation in front of the Canadian Senate. I don't know if you saw that or not, and there's no reason for you to have paid attention to it, but if you look up Jordan Peterson and Senate, you'll see that along with a practicing lawyer, I made exactly that case to a number of Canadian senators, telling them that by supporting this legislation, they were actually doing a disservice to the people that they purported to be helping. So it isn't that biologically there are two sexes, although as an approximation, that's true. As a decent approximation, it's true. It gets slightly messy because there are a multiplicity of ways that sex differences manifest themselves. And there's a fair bit of variability across all of those different manifestations. And so, as I said, you can have feminine man and a masculine woman. That happens very frequently. It's just more often you have a feminine woman and a masculine man.
Yes. All right, that perfectly explains my question. And
okay.
So next, postmodernist thought, and I think you kind of already talked about this when you said the American postmodernists got this right, and that I'm going to summarize very quickly because you've already answered, but you say that you see scientific realism as nested in Darwinian competition, and so it's reasonably objective that the
No, that's not quite right.
Okay.
No, I would say that it isn't obvious to me that there is any truth that is superordinate to the truth that's established in a Darwinian fashion, and that includes our notion of objective reality. Now, that's where Sam Harris and I had a major disagreement, but
yes.
Again, it's a consequence of my pragmatic thinking. You see, the Darwinian claim fundamentally is that the only way that you can come up with a definition of truth is through an evolutionary model that uses death as the punishment, being wrong. And so one of the things I was arguing with Sam Harris about is whether or not our current conceptualizations of objective truth are necessarily true in a Darwinian sense, and if they're not, which form of truth should take priority. And I was arguing that Darwinian truth should always take priority. And Sam was arguing that, he didn't particularly like that stance. Although and that's basically what our argument circulated around.
All right.
So the problem is that we never know. Let's see, what's the problem exactly? Even our objective truth is seriously bounded in ways that we don't understand.
Yes.
And claim it at any given moment as having some sort of fundamental ontological status outside of its Darwinian utility strikes me as dangerous, especially given how transmutable scientific theories tend to be.
So if I'm going to oversimplify things, I'm going to say that liberals tend to think with the anterior cingulate cortex of the brain, with future applications, possibilities, likeliness, consequences. And conservatives...
that's also the part of the brain that's involved in social cognition, eh?
Yes. And conservatives
so that's
tend to think with the
idea,
amygdala. Yes. So here, I'm going to read what I wrote here.
Okay.
For example, low populations in rural areas would potentially possess more views of self-autonomy, working hard, family values, increasing population, protecting oneself and one's kind due to the types of motivations in the hypothalamus being more applicable to survival, while highly populated areas would focus potentially more on thinking, tolerance, community values, stabilizing population, but additionally might not focus so much on protecting life or raising children. These differences could explain vastly the moral behaviors being ideally or objectively true based on incalculable variables. So
you better run that one through me again. By me again, 'cause it's quite complicated.
yes, it is. So I am suggesting that if we are to look at a reason why how people think, we can look at how people think as being nested in Darwinian competition. So, so if there's a low populated area, you would think, okay, what traits, incalculable but somewhat calculable traits would be necessary for them to be raised, and what traits, mostly in the hypothalamus, I'm assuming, and what traits would be more applicable for large cities. So it's almost completely possible that the politics of liberals is perfect for their situation in a big city, and the politics of conservatives is...
Yeah, it's a good hypothesis. It's one that you should think about. Like, it's a reasonable hypothesis. Now, I'd have to think it through a long time before I, because you're suggesting that a conservative philosophy is more useful in a low populated area.
Yes, I am.
Liberal philosophy. Yeah, it's possible. I don't know. It's worth thinking through.
All right, that's because I've been thinking about that a lot. That's the main thing I think about. And I'm not saying necessarily directly that, but at least the possibility of that's why.
Yeah, well, one thing you could do to some degree to begin with is just run a correlation between size of the community and political proclivity. You should be able to get that data online.
Yep.
I mean, it wouldn't be proof, because it might be that the more liberal types are also more likely to move to the cities, right? In which case, you'd be leaving conservatives behind, and it's not because they're more well adapted. Well, even then, it might be because they're more well adapted to smaller communities. It's a good idea. I don't know what to think of it, but it's worth thinking about.
And we have that data just through political polls, and you'll see whenever you look at a map, it's all red because the red is in the smaller areas and the blue looks small because there's more people there. So it does tend to work out.
It's a plausible hypothesis. It might be interesting to look in the red states only and see if it's still true there.
Yes. All right. So thank you for that. It means a lot that you think of that as a possibility. And then I have one last question on religion, and I've been watching your psychological interpretations of the Bible, as well as I have read the maps of meaning. So I may have missed something there, but this question, so neurophysiologically, to my understanding, the way the human brain is constructed is such that happiness is achieved in the pursuit of a noble aim rather than the attainment of the goal itself. You've talked about this multiple times. It's not happiness precisely, but that'll do. It's more like a sense of meaningful engagement, which I think is better than happiness, but that's okay. We can go with happiness for now. All right. So if there's no noble aim, we are limited to simple pleasures which do not sustain a positive.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You're limited to impulsive pleasures. Yes, and those are ones that don't necessarily have a good medium to long-term outcome.
So if I am to take a psychological or moral view of biblical teaching, unlike a scientific view, am I right in construing that the idea of external happiness without suffering exists as a brilliantly thought out construct which invokes a sense of purpose and happiness? And if I am to make that conclusion, can I see those concepts in the moral psychology of the Bible as manipulative, or does the defiance of natural law rule out a literal interpretation?
Okay, go back, read that again.
So if I'm to assume all of this with heaven and hell, is it eternal happiness? Is that, can you see that as manipulative? As like it doesn't.
You can. you can. I mean, certainly Marx did, and I would say Freud did as well. One of the problems, because Freud thought of, religion as, let's call it both manipulative and immature, because it guaranteed people the certainty of life after death, and it allowed them the comfort of knowing that an all-seeing father was watching over them. Okay, and Freud regarded that, let's say, as immature and manipulative, but he didn't have a good explanation for why people came up with the idea of hell. Because if you were just going to go for immature and manipulative, it might as well be all positive, right? Why put the negative in there? And you could say skeptically, well, hell is where you put your enemies, but that's a really cynical interpretation, because many religious people, and now certainly even, but certainly throughout the Middle Ages, were terrified that hell was something that they were headed to, not that their enemies were going to. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that that's a reasonable interpretation historically. Now, Marx would say that religion would do whatever it could to manipulate people so that the power structures, the economic power structures, could stay in place. But given that religious structures, and this is, I would say, particularly, but not only true of Christianity, have played a tremendous role in giving additional voice to the people who were downtrodden and enslaved, that also is that's not a historically credible argument. Sometimes that religious teachings are used to buttress the people who are in control, and sometimes they're used to oppose them. So I don't buy that for a second. And then, so no, I don't think the manipulation argument I don't think it's a credible one. I mean, I understand it, and I'm an admirer of Freud, but I think he got it wrong. I think he got that wrong. And that was certainly one of the places that he disagreed most profoundly with Carl Jung. And I think Jung came out of it right, and Freud came out of it wrong. And then I think the Marxist critique of religion, it's just like every other Marxist critique. It's like, you can treat religious structures as if they're oppressive power structures only, but, it's just a reduction of a multi-dimensional complexity to a relatively predictable unidimensional phenomena. It's not helpful. It's not a helpful intellectual exercise past its immediate self-evidence. Because the self-evidence is some religious people are corrupt. It's like, right. Obviously.
That's fair. And given I'm taking one concept, heaven, way out of context of a huge bundle of things. So that's a fair point.
There's a writer named I should tell you about this guy, Jeffrey Burton Russell. Jeffrey Burton Russell. You'd like him.
Okay.
Yeah, he's written a couple of books on heaven and a very good series on the devil as a historian. So he's a historian of the idea of heaven and the idea of the devil.
Okay.
So he had 3-volume series on the devil. One is Mephistopheles, which I think is the best one. But if you're interested in that kind of idea, Jeffrey Burton Russell is a good person to take a look at. He's credible. Credible historian, and I think his books are extremely interesting. So, and he delves into the idea of heaven in a much more fundamental way than the typical, especially the typical sort of casually religious critical postmodernist who always assumes that there's nothing to it except power dynamics. It's foolish, because heaven at minimum is a vision of a better future.
Mm-hmm.
And even as only that, it's by no means trivial. I mean, human beings are about the only creatures that can imagine a better future. And so heaven is like the archetypal better future.
Yes.
And so you don't want to just demolish that idea too casually, because we're always working, unless we're pathological, we're always working for a better future. So, and to think of heaven as the idea that's sort of shining behind that, the Platonic ideal of the idea of a better future, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to think, and you don't want to just throw it away. That'd be throwing away one of the greatest ideas of mankind. And that doesn't mean I think that people should be political utopians. It's not the same thing.
Yes. It's the concept that has the psychological effects on the way people behave.
That's right. And it's the concept that's of value. Like, I think the difference between the Christian idea of heaven and the political utopian idea of heaven is that for Christians, heaven is what would be achieved through the use of truth. individual truth. And for the political utopian, it would be as a consequence of the instantiation of some particular political system. No, those are not the same thing at all.
All right. And then I have about 10 more minutes by my time.
Yep.
So you answered
those
all my questions.
By the way. They're really good questions.
Thank you. I spent a long time thinking which to ask, because obviously there's a million questions. You're one of the only people I've had faith in that could answer some of the questions I've had.
Yeah, so what do you do?
I like to think of myself as a philosopher, like Socrates.
Are you a student?
I am a student. I go in and out of school. I tend to make money when I need to, doing odd jobs, and read all day. Like, I don't have a lot of value on society. Society is very weird to me.
What are your future plans?
I want to go into academia. I want to do research.
Yeah. Well, you're pretty smart, you know. That's a good plan. Those are good questions.
School is expensive, and the types of schools that I go to are kind of boring. If I could go to your class every day, I would be the happiest person ever. But the type of teachers, not that they're not intelligent, they're just not a Sam Harris or a Neil deGrasse Tyson or a Jordan Peterson. I spend a lot of time reading through Einstein over and over again, reading through or listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I like learning. The university doesn't give me substantial means of learning. I don't feel like I learn much.
I get the picture. The problem that you've got is that there's some utility in credentials. So, there's always the possibility of going to university for the credentials and educating yourself at the same time.
Yes.
Which is what you really have to do if you go to university anyways. I know but it's always an uncomfortable meld between what you want and what should be and what you can get.
Yes. Mark Twain says, I never let my schooling interfere with my education.
Well, right. Yes, exactly. That's perfect. Yes.
So that's what I'm doing. I have a couple semesters left. The problem is, I don't know. I have a couple semesters left. I go to the University of Michigan. The problem is my motivation, which I've watched a lot of videos on your motivation. I can't find the motivation to do the work. If I was at Harvard or Princeton or Yale or somewhere where I was challenged, where I would be this is a huge opportunity for me.
You have to build the damn challenge in. You got to build the challenge in for yourself somehow. Have you done the Future Authoring Program?
The what program?
Future Authoring Program?
I have done that. Yes.
Did it help?
I think I was too focused subconsciously with the reasons why it would help. Determining why this would help me. It's helping me because of this. It's helping me because of that. And kind of playing mind games with myself, making it so it didn't really help me as much.
Yeah. Well, because, the fact is, given your level of let's say, intellect, you would have to have a pretty good goal to it's not atypical for someone to be very smart and very open, but not very conscientious. And I don't know if you're not very conscientious. Maybe you are, but what you've said so far suggests that you're higher in openness and lower in conscientiousness. What you need to rectify that, if you can rectify it, is a suitably lofty goal. And so but if you didn't do the Future Authoring Program in a manner that helped you establish that goal, it probably isn't going to help you. You obviously need a reason. And fair enough,
So I guess my goal would to be going to grad school at an Ivy League college. I would say that's my goal.
That's a good goal.
And I'll have to. At one point, I wrote a letter to basically everybody that works at the Harvard admissions by finding their the emails and sent a letter explaining my situation, my family situation, why I didn't get good grades in high school, why I've never been an atypical good student, but I have a large drive and motivation to learn, and I know every single professor at Harvard, and I'm familiar with their work. I've read their abstracts in their journals. Not every single one, I'm exaggerating, but I'm very familiar, and with Yale too, and wanted to go into linguistics. And I never got a response back, and I kind of just sunk back into my read and ignore the universe type of thing, but you were right. I need to set a goal and not sink back into my behavioral existential drift, but actually go towards that goal.
Yeah. Well, you have a good goal to go to a credible graduate school and to pursue an academic career is a good goal. But you also might want to really think hard about what the hell you're going to do if that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you're kind of built for it. So it'd be a good pursuit. And, you sound like the kind of guy who could use a PhD.
Thank you.
So, your questions were smart. I had to listen to them hard, and you thought about them a lot, and they were sophisticated. So, and that puts you in the top, 1% of students, probably something like that. It's something like that, 1 to 5%. And so you've got the right kind of mind for it. And with a mind like that, you also really want to get yourself disciplined because it's also safer if you have a mind like yours to get disciplined, because the problem with a mind like yours is you'll be chasing it everywhere like someone with a badly trained bloodhound.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that can be really hard on a person over time, because it's easy to be one of those people that has a tremendous amount of potential but doesn't have it realized, and boy, that's a rough life by the time you're about 40.
Yes, I'm also what is linguistically defined as a polymath, where academia is one interest that I'm showing you right now because you're an academic, but I have a wide variety of interests like music, art.
You're very high in openness. That's the trait
that's where my openness is high. So I do have other opportunity. Childish Gambino, Donald Glover?
No.
He's a rapper and a stand-up comedian, and he's writing Deadpool. He's done...
Oh, yeah.
Yes. He's very, very... I identify a lot with him, looking at him as a role model. He does a lot of different things, and the profanity in his work discredits his talent by a lot of people, but, so did Shakespeare. I mean, basically... what the things he says is witty and punny and profane, of course, but so is Shakespeare, for the time. But I identify a lot with him.
Well, I'm afraid I have to bring our talk to a halt because I have someone else who's right up here. But look.